The scream tore through the palace grounds before the sun had even finished rising. Alara Voss froze in the middle of the courtyard, her breath catching in her throat. Around her, hundreds of women in fine gowns turned their heads toward the sound, their painted faces suddenly pale with fear. Guards rushed past her, their boots pounding against the stone path, their hands already reaching for the weapons at their sides. For one heartbeat, Ilara thought the mate selection had ended before it even began. Then a second sound followed the first. Not a scream of danger, but a cry of pain. An old man's voice, weak and broken, coming from somewhere near the servants' gate at the far edge of the courtyard. The guards changed direction, running toward the noise instead of away from it, and slowly, the crowd of hopeful young women began to breathe again. Ilara did not move with them. While the others turned back to their mirrors and their hairpins, fixing themselves for the king who had not yet appeared, she found herself walking the other way. Something about that cry had settled into her chest like a stone, and she could not shake it loose. She was not like the other women here. She had not come to Blackthorn Ridge dreaming of crowns or thrones. Her mother had begged her for weeks, reminding her that every unmated woman between the ages of 18 and 25 was required to attend, that refusing to come would bring shame on their family and their pack. So Ilara had come, but she had no intention of catching the king's eye. She barely wanted to be here at all. The gate area was crowded when she reached it, servants and guards forming a tight circle around something on the ground. Ilara pushed through gently, using the small size that had always made her easy to underestimate, and finally saw what everyone else was staring at. An old man lay crumpled against the stone wall. His clothes were little more than rags, gray with dust, and torn at the shoulders. His hair was long and matted, falling in tangled waves down his back, and his skin was thin and papery, stretched tight over bones that had not seen enough food in a very long time. One of his arms was bent at an angle that made Ilara's stomach turn, and a dark line of blood ran from his elbow down to his wrist. Nobody was helping him. The guards stood around him, unsure of what to do with a beggar who had wandered into the most important event of the year. A few servants whispered to each other, clearly debating whether to call for a healer or simply drag him away before the king arrived and saw the mess. Ilara did not wait for anyone to decide. She dropped to her knees beside the old man, ignoring the way her fine dress pressed into the dirt, and gently lifted his injured arm to examine it. He flinched at her touch, his eyes fluttering open, cloudy and unfocused, but he did not pull away. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice carrying the same calm tone her mother had used with every frightened patient who ever came through their door. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help." One of the guards, a tall man with a scar along his jaw, stepped forward. "Miss, you should not be touching him. We don't know where he came from. He could be dangerous, or sick." "He's neither," Ilara said without looking up. "He's hurt, and he's hungry. Someone bring me water, please." There was something in her voice that made the guard hesitate, then obey. A young servant girl darted off toward the kitchens, and within moments, a cup of water was pressed into Ilara's hands. She held it carefully to the old man's cracked lips, tilting it just enough for him to drink without choking. He swallowed slowly, his throat working with visible effort, and when he finished, his eyes found hers for the first time. There was something strange in them, something that did not match the rest of his broken appearance. A sharpness, a flicker of awareness that seemed to fight its way up through a heavy fog. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely more than air. "What happened to you?" Ilara asked, carefully turning his arm to inspect the wound more closely. It was not fresh, she realized. Days old, maybe longer, left untreated, and allowed to fester at the edges. "How did you get hurt?" The old man's brow furrowed, as if the question required him to reach into a place inside his mind that had gone dark and cold. I don't remember," he murmured. "There was a fire. I remember a fire. And running, so much running." "A fire?" Ilara repeated gently. "Where? When?" But his gaze had already drifted away from her, staring past her shoulder at nothing at all, his lips moving without sound. Ilara had seen this before, back home, when soldiers returned from the border skirmishes, with their minds broken along with their bodies. Sometimes the past became too heavy to hold, and the mind simply let pieces of it fall away. She did not press him further. Instead, she turned to the guard who had spoken to her earlier. This wound needs to be cleaned properly, and it may need to be reset. Do you have a healer here at the palace? There is one, but she attends only to the royal family and honored guests, the guard said, his tone apologetic but firm. A beggar at the gate is not exactly. Then I'll do it myself, Ilara said, cutting him off before he could finish the thought. I trained under my mother. I know how to clean and wrap a wound. Just bring me clean cloth and something to hold his arm still. The guard looked at her for a long moment, clearly weighing the strangeness of the situation. A candidate for the mate selection, kneeling in the dirt beside a nameless old beggar, giving orders as if she had every right to do so. But something about her steady hands and clear eyes convinced him, and he nodded, sending another servant running for supplies. While she waited, Ilara studied the old man's face more closely. Beneath the dirt and the years of hardship, there was something almost noble about his features. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, even now softened by age and suffering. His eyes, when they were not clouded with confusion, held a shape and color that struck her as oddly familiar, though she could not place why. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The old man's eyes snapped back to hers, and for a moment, panic flashed across his face. His good hand reached up and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't tell them," he whispered urgently. "Please, don't tell them I'm here. They'll find me. They'll finish what they started." Ilara's heart began to pound. Who will find you? But the fear in his eyes had already begun to dissolve back into confusion, his grip loosening as quickly as it had tightened. "I don't know," he said, sounding almost bewildered by his own words. "I don't know why I said that." The servant returned with cloth and a small wooden splint, and Ilara set to work, cleaning the wound with careful, practiced hands, while the old man watched her in silence. She worked quickly but gently, wrapping the splint against his forearm and securing it with strips of cloth, all while the sounds of the mate selection continued behind her. Trumpets, laughter, the excited chatter of hundreds of women who had no idea that the most important thing happening in the courtyard that morning was not taking place anywhere near the king's arrival platform. When she finished, she helped the old man sit up against the wall, propping a folded cloak behind his back for support. "There," she said. "That should hold until we can get you somewhere warm and dry." "Why?" the old man asked, studying her face with those strange, familiar eyes. "Why are you helping me? You could be in there, right now, trying to win a crown." Ilara let out a small, tired laugh. "I never wanted a crown. I came here because my mother insisted, and because refusing would have brought trouble on my family. But sitting in a courtyard covered in perfume, waiting for a man I've never met to glance in my direction, has never once felt like something worth doing. This," she gestured to his arm, "feels worth doing." The old man studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You have a kind heart," he said finally. "The world does not deserve hearts like yours. It breaks them too easily." "Maybe," Ilara said. "But a broken heart still beats. That's more than some people can say." A horn sounded from the front of the courtyard, long and deep, echoing off the palace walls. The crowd's chatter rose into an excited roar, and Ilara knew without needing to look that the king had finally arrived. She glanced toward the front gates, torn between duty and the quiet urgency of the moment behind her. "You should go," the old man said, noticing her hesitation. "They will be looking for you." "They won't miss one face in a crowd of hundreds," Ilara said, though she knew it was only partly true. Her mother would notice. Her mother always noticed. "Besides, you still need somewhere to rest. I can't just leave you here." She turned to the guard who had remained nearby, watching the entire exchange with a curious expression. "Is there somewhere in the servants' quarters where he could stay?" "Just until he's stronger. I'll make sure he isn't any trouble." The guard glanced toward the front of the courtyard, where the roar of the crowd was reaching a fever pitch, then back at the frail old man leaning against the wall. Something in his expression softened. "There's an empty room near the kitchens. Not much, but it's warm, and it has a bed." "Thank you," Ilara said, relief flooding through her. "Truly, thank you." Together, with the help of two servants, they managed to get the old man to his feet and moving slowly toward the servants' entrance. He leaned heavily on Alara's shoulder, his steps shuffling and unsteady, but he did not complain once, even though she could see the pain etched into every line of his face. As they reached the doorway, he paused and looked back over his shoulder, toward the distant sound of the crowd cheering for their king. Something crossed his features then, something Alara could not name, grief perhaps, or longing, or both, tangled together into something too heavy for words. "Do you know him?" Alara asked softly. "The king?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally, and his voice cracked on the words. "I feel like I should. There's something about that horn, the sound of it, that makes my chest ache, but I can't remember why." Alara did not push him further. She simply guided him through the doorway and into the cool shadows of the servants' hall, away from the noise and the spectacle, toward whatever quiet safety she could offer him. Behind her, in the courtyard she had left, King Cale Ashworth stepped onto the platform, before hundreds of hopeful faces, his expression carved from stone, his eyes already scanning the crowd with the practiced disinterest of a man who had been forced into a ceremony he never wanted. He did not know, not yet, that the woman who would change everything about his life had already turned her back on him, choosing instead to kneel in the dirt, beside a broken old stranger, whose face she could not quite place, but whose eyes, though neither of them knew it yet, were the very same eyes that looked back at Cale every time he stared into a mirror. The selection had begun, but the story that mattered most was already being written somewhere else entirely, in a quiet room near the kitchens, where a healer's daughter sat beside a nameless old man and gently smoothed the tangled hair away from his forehead, promising him, in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear, that she would keep him safe. Neither of them could have known how much that small promise would come to mean. Not yet. Not until the truth began to surface, piece by piece, thread by thread, pulling them both toward a destiny neither had chosen, but neither would ever regret. For now, there was only the quiet room, the old man's shallow breathing, and the steady, patient kindness of a woman who had never once cared about crowns, but who was about to become part of one anyway. 3 days passed before Alara saw the old man open his eyes with real clarity. She had visited him every morning before the sun rose, and every evening after the candles in the great hall were lit for supper, slipping away from the crowd of women who spent their days practicing curtsies and whispering about the king's cold, unreadable expression. None of them noticed her absence. None of them cared to. Alara had quickly become invisible among the perfumed silks and jeweled hairpins, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, she was grateful for it. The small room near the kitchens had become something like a sanctuary. It smelled of bread and wood smoke, and the narrow window let in just enough morning light to make the space feel less like a prison and more like a quiet corner of the world where nobody expected anything from her at all. "You look stronger today," Alara said, setting down a tray of porridge and warm bread beside the old man's bed. "Your color has come back." He managed a small smile, the first real one she had seen from him. "That is thanks to you, and to whatever kitchen witchcraft went into this bread." Alara laughed, surprised by the sudden warmth in his voice. It was strange, she thought, how quickly a person's spirit could return once their body began to heal. 3 days ago, he had barely been able to speak in full sentences. Now his eyes tracked her movements with sharp attention, and his words came easier, more confident, even if the deeper memories still refused to surface. "Do you remember anything more?" she asked gently, settling into the wooden chair beside his bed. "About who you are, or where you came from?" The old man's smile faded, replaced by the familiar furrow of confusion that always appeared whenever he tried to reach backward into his own mind. "Pieces," he said slowly. "Flashes, mostly. A room with tall windows. The smell of pine trees in winter. A woman's laughter, though I can't see her face when I try to picture her." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window. "And a boy. I keep seeing a boy, running through a field, calling out for someone. I think he might be calling for me." Alara's chest tightened at the sadness in his voice. "Do you know his name?" "No," the old man admitted, frustration creeping into his tone. "It's like trying to hold water in my hands. The moment I think I have it, it slips away." "It will come back," Alara said. though she had no real way of knowing that. These things take time. My mother always said the mind heals slower than the body, but it does heal. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is, Ilara said, a fond smile crossing her face. She's been the healer for our pack for as long as I can remember. I grew up learning from her, watching her set bones and stitch wounds, and calm frightened patients with nothing but her voice. I suppose some of it rubbed off on me. More than some, I think, the old man said, glancing down at his splinted arm, which was healing cleanly thanks to her care. You have a gift, child. Do not waste it chasing crowns you don't want. Ilara's smile faltered slightly. You remembered that I said that. I remember more than you might think, he said, his eyes suddenly sharp again, studying her with an intensity that made her feel, for a brief moment, as though he could see straight through her. I may not remember my own name, but I remember kindness when I see it. It is rare enough that it tends to stay with a person. They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the old man eating slowly, while Ilara watched the steam rise from her own untouched cup of tea, her thoughts drifting toward the strange fragments he had shared. A field, a boy calling his name, a fire that had left him broken and alone, wandering until he collapsed at the gates of a palace he seemed to both fear and long for at the same time. None of it made sense yet, but something in her gut told her it would, eventually, and that whatever truth waited on the other side of his broken memories would not be a small or simple one. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, heavy and deliberate, nothing like the light, hurried steps of the kitchen servants. Ilara straightened in her chair just as the door swung open without a knock, and a tall figure stepped into the room, filling the small space with an authority that seemed to press against the very walls. She recognized him instantly, though she had only glimpsed him from a distance days earlier during the opening ceremony. King Cale Ashworth stood in the doorway, his dark eyes sweeping over the room with sharp, assessing precision. He wore simple black clothing, rather than the ceremonial robes she had seen him in before, but even without the trappings of royalty, there was no mistaking the weight of command that surrounded him. Ilara rose quickly to her feet, dropping into a hurried, imperfect curtsy. Your Majesty. Cale did not acknowledge the greeting. His gaze had already moved past her, fixing instead on the old man in the bed, studying him with an expression Ilara could not quite read, something between suspicion and unease. I was told, Cale said, his voice low and measured, that one of my selection candidates abandoned the ceremony to tend to a beggar found at my gates. I confess, I did not believe it until I saw the empty space in the courtyard records myself. Ilara felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she refused to look away from him. He was injured, Your Majesty. He needed help. I did what any decent person would do. Did you? Cale said, and though his tone was calm, there was an edge beneath it, sharp as a blade hidden in silk. Most decent people in that courtyard were far too occupied competing for my attention to notice an injured man at all. Yet you walked away from the single event most women in this kingdom would give anything to attend. I never wanted to be here in the first place, Ilara said, before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the boldness of it, bracing for his anger. Instead, something flickered across Cale's face. Not anger, but curiosity, sharp and sudden, as though her honesty had caught him entirely off guard. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing slightly, before he finally turned his full attention to the old man in the bed. Who are you? Cale asked, his voice quieter now, though no less commanding. Where do you come from? The old man met his gaze steadily, and for a moment, something passed between them, some invisible current that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavier. Ilara watched, holding her breath without quite knowing why. I don't know, the old man said finally. I remember very little. A fire, running, a boy calling my name. Beyond that, everything is fog. Cale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stepped closer to the bed, studying the old man's face with an intensity that made Ilara shift uncomfortably where she stood. There was something in the king's expression now, something raw beneath the careful control, though he masked it quickly. What is your name? Cale asked again, more insistent this time. I don't remember that either, the old man said softly. This kind woman has been caring for me these past days. I owe her my life. though I cannot even offer her the courtesy of a name in return." Cale's gaze flicked briefly to Alara, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before returning to the old man. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid with a tension Alara could not fully understand. "He should be examined by the royal healer," Cale said finally, his voice reverting to its earlier, commanding tone, properly this time, not hidden away in a servant's room. "With respect, Your Majesty," Alara said, surprising herself with her own persistence. "He has been resting well here. Moving him now, before his strength has fully returned, could do more harm than good." Cale turned to look at her fully then, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his expression. Not quite respect, not yet, but something close to it. An acknowledgement that she had spoken to him not as a subject cowering before her king, but as someone who genuinely believed she knew better in this one small matter. "You are certain of this?" he asked. "I am," Alara said, holding his gaze. "I trained under my mother, who has served as a healer for our pack for 20 years. I know what I'm doing." There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them like a held breath. Finally, Cale gave a single, short nod. "Very well. He remains here, under your care, for now. But I want him watched, and I want to be informed the moment his memory returns, however small the detail." "Of course, Your Majesty." Cale turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, glancing back one final time at the old man, who had grown quiet and thoughtful, his eyes fixed on some distant point none of them could see. Something about the king's expression in that final glance struck Alara as deeply, achingly sad, though she could not begin to guess why. The door closed behind him, and the room fell silent once more, save for the crackle of the small fire in the corner hearth. "He seemed troubled," the old man murmured after a long moment, almost to himself. "He did," Alara agreed, settling back into her chair, her mind turning over the strange tension that had filled the room during the king's visit. "I wonder why." Neither of them spoke the thought that had begun to take root in both their minds, quiet and uncertain, too fragile yet to be given words. But it lingered in the air between them, growing a little stronger with every passing hour, waiting patiently for the moment when it would finally, undeniably, refuse to be ignored any longer. Outside, the sun began to set over the palace grounds, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, while somewhere in his private chambers, King Cale Ashworth sat alone with a memory he had buried 18 years ago, and a face that refused, no matter how hard he tried, to leave his thoughts. Word traveled fast within the palace walls, faster than Alara had expected. By the following morning, the servants had begun whispering about the strange candidate who spent her nights tending to a nameless beggar instead of preparing for her chance with the king. Some of the whispers were kind, calling her generous and soft-hearted. Others were less forgiving, calling her foolish for wasting an opportunity that hundreds of other women would have given anything to have. Alara ignored all of it. She had never cared much for the opinions of strangers, and she cared even less now, with something far more important occupying her thoughts. The old man's condition continued to improve with each passing day. His arm had begun to heal properly, the swelling gone, and the bone setting well beneath the splint. His appetite had returned in full, and with it, a growing strength that allowed him to sit up on his own, then stand, then take slow, careful steps around the small room, with Alara's steady hand supporting his elbow. But it was his mind that fascinated her most. Every day, small pieces of memory surfaced, unpredictable and fragmented, like scattered puzzle pieces with no clear picture forming between them yet. A garden with white flowers, the sound of a woman singing, the particular ache of missing someone whose name he could no longer recall. "Tell me about the boy again," Alara said one afternoon, as she helped him settle into the chair by the window, where the sunlight fell warm across his face. "The one calling your name in the field." The old man's expression grew distant, the way it always did when he reached for that particular memory. He was young, perhaps 10, maybe 11 years old, dark hair, much like the king's, now that I think of it. He paused, his brow furrowing. He was running toward me, calling out, but I couldn't reach him. There was fire between us, so much fire, and smoke, and screaming. Alara's hands stilled where she had been arranging the blanket over his knees. Like the king's? I suppose, the old man said, though he did not seem to notice the significance of his own words. Perhaps it's simply a common look among the pack here. Dark hair, sharp features. Many men might share such traits. But Alara could not shake the feeling that had settled over her, cold and persistent, ever since Cale's visit to the room 3 days earlier. She had seen the way the king studied the old man's face, searching for something he seemed both desperate to find and terrified of confirming. She had seen the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his voice that had not quite managed to hide the tremor underneath. She thought, too, of the palace records she had overheard 2 servants discussing near the kitchens the previous evening, speaking in hushed, careful tones about the former Alpha King, Cale's father, who had vanished nearly 2 decades ago during a violent coup led by a rival pack. Presumed dead, the servants had said. No body was ever found. The pack had mourned him for exactly 1 year, as tradition required, before formally declaring the throne passed to his young son, who had been little more than a child himself at the time, a boy with dark hair, calling out across a field of fire. Alara pushed the thought away, telling herself it was foolish, a wild leap built from nothing more than fragmented memories and desperate hope. And yet, the thought refused to leave her entirely, settling instead into some quiet corner of her mind, waiting. "You've gone quiet," the old man observed, studying her face with the same sharp attention he had shown from the very beginning, even when confusion clouded so much of the rest of his mind. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing important," Alara said, forcing a smile. "Just wondering how you're feeling today." "Stronger," he said, "thanks entirely to you. Though I confess, I feel a strange restlessness too, as though my body has healed faster than whatever is broken inside my mind, and now I am left waiting, trapped between who I was and who I am now, with no way to bridge the gap." "It will come," Alara said again, though the words felt increasingly hollow, even to her own ears. "I promise you, it will come." The old man reached out with his good hand and gently patted hers, a gesture so fatherly and warm that it caught her entirely off guard, tightening something in her chest that she hadn't expected. "You have been kinder to me than I deserve, child. Whoever raised you did a fine job of it." "My mother," Alara said softly. "She always told me that kindness costs nothing and gives everything. I suppose I've simply always believed her." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light shift slowly across the floor, until the sound of footsteps once again echoed in the hallway outside. This time, however, the steps were lighter, quicker, less deliberate than the king's had been days before. The door opened to reveal a young woman Alara did not recognize, dressed in the fine silks of a noble candidate, her golden hair pinned elaborately atop her head, her expression carrying the particular sharpness of someone unused to being ignored. "So this is where you've been hiding," the woman said, her eyes sweeping over the small room with poorly concealed disdain. "I wondered where the strange girl who abandoned her chance with the king had disappeared to." Alara rose slowly to her feet, recognizing the woman now as Bianca Hale, daughter of a powerful pack from the Eastern Territories, and widely regarded among the other candidates as the frontrunner for the king's attention. "Can I help you with something?" "You can help me," Bianca said, stepping further into the room, "by explaining why you'd waste your one chance at a crown tending to some old beggar, when the rest of us have spent every waking moment trying to earn even a single glance from His Majesty." "I never wanted a crown," Alara said simply, "so it isn't much of a sacrifice." Bianca's eyes narrowed, clearly unsatisfied with an answer that offered her nothing to argue against. Her gaze shifted then to the old man in the chair, studying him with obvious curiosity. "And who exactly is this? The palace is buzzing with rumors. Some say the king himself visited this room." "He's a man who needed help," Alara said, careful to keep her voice even. "That's all anyone needs to know." "Interesting," Bianca said, though her tone suggested she did not believe that for a moment. "Well, enjoy your little charity project, Healer's Daughter. While you're busy playing nursemaid, the rest of us will be securing our futures." She turned on her heel and left as quickly as she had arrived, the door clicking shut firmly behind her. The old man watched the exchange with quiet amusement, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth once they were alone again. "She did not seem especially fond of you." "Bianca doesn't seem especially fond of anyone who might stand in her way," Alara said, shaking her head. "Don't worry about her. She's all noise and no real danger." But something about the encounter left Alara feeling uneasy, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck that she could not quite explain. It was not Bianca's jealousy that concerned her, not really. It was the reminder that word of the old man's presence had spread further than she had realized, drawing curious eyes and whispered questions from every corner of the palace. If the wrong person heard the wrong rumor, connected the wrong pieces together before the truth was fully understood, there was no telling what might happen. And the old man's own words, spoken in that first fevered moment at the gate, echoed suddenly and sharply in her memory. "Don't tell them I'm here. They'll find me. They'll finish what they started." Alara glanced toward him now, watching the peaceful, unaware expression on his face as he gazed out the window at the golden afternoon light, and felt a fresh wave of protective determination settle over her, firm and unshakable. Whatever secrets his broken mind was still hiding, whatever danger might still be lurking somewhere beyond these palace walls, she would not let anything happen to him, not after everything they had already been through together. Not when he had come to trust her so completely, so quickly, in a way that felt like it mattered far more than any crown or ceremony ever could. "I think," the old man said suddenly, breaking the silence, his voice thoughtful and slow, "that I remember a name today, just a fragment of one." Alara's heart leapt. "What is it?" He frowned, concentrating hard, his good hand pressing lightly against his temple, as though he could physically coax the memory forward. "Rowan," he said finally, testing the word on his tongue like something unfamiliar and strange. I think that might be my name. Rowan." Alara went very still, the name settling over her like the first cold drop of rain before a storm. She had heard that name before, whispered in the kitchen hallways just the night before, spoken with the particular reverence reserved for the dead. Rowan Ashworth, the former Alpha King, Kale's missing father. She said nothing. Not yet. Not until she was certain, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the teapot, buying herself a moment to steady her racing thoughts. Whatever was coming, whatever truth was slowly clawing its way up through the fog of his broken memory, she had the distinct and dizzying feeling that nothing in the palace would ever be quite the same again once it fully surfaced. And somewhere deep within her, beneath the fear and the uncertainty, a quiet voice whispered that she was standing at the very beginning of something far larger than herself. Something that had already begun pulling her, thread by careful thread, toward a destiny she had never once imagined wanting, and now could not imagine escaping. Alara did not sleep that night. She lay awake in the small chamber she shared with two other candidates, staring up at the shadowed ceiling while their soft, even breathing filled the darkness around her. The name echoed over and over in her mind, refusing to let her rest. Rowan Ashworth, a name spoken only in whispers within these palace walls, tied to grief that ran deeper than most people dared to speak of openly. She told herself she could be wrong. Rowan was not an uncommon name among the northern packs. It was entirely possible that the old man in the servants' quarters was simply a stranger who happened to share it with the missing king, nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence layered on top of an already strange situation. But even as she tried to convince herself of this, she could not ignore the mounting evidence that had been quietly gathering since the very first day. The dark hair the old man had described on the boy in his memories, so similar to Kale's own. The fire and the running, matching whispered rumors of the violent coup that had taken the former king from his people. The way Kale himself had studied the old man's face with such raw, barely concealed emotion, as though searching for something he was both desperate to find and terrified to confirm. By morning, Alara had made up her mind. She needed more information, and there was only one place in the palace likely to hold it. The royal archive was tucked away in the western wing of the palace, a quiet, dusty room lined floor to ceiling with shelves of records, genealogies, and historical accounts stretching back generations. Alara had never had reason to visit it before, but she had heard the other candidates mention it in passing, usually while complaining about the tediousness of palace protocol lessons that required occasional research. She slipped away from the morning's scheduled activities, claiming a headache to the chaperone assigned to watch over her group, and made her way quietly through the palace corridors until she found the archive's heavy wooden door. Inside, an elderly woman sat behind a small desk, surrounded by towering shelves and the comforting, musty smell of old parchment. "Can I help you, dear?" the woman asked, peering up at Ilara over a pair of thin spectacles. "I'm looking for records," Ilara said carefully, "about the former Alpha King, Rowan Ashworth." The woman's expression shifted immediately, curiosity and caution mingling behind her spectacles. "That's an unusual request for one of the selection candidates. Most of you are far more interested in the current king than the previous one." "I have my reasons," Ilara said, offering nothing further. After a long moment of consideration, the woman rose and disappeared into the shelves, returning several minutes later with a thin, leather-bound volume that she set carefully on the desk between them. "This covers the events of 18 years ago. I must warn you, it is not a happy read." Ilara thanked her and carried the book to a small table near the window, settling into the quiet solitude of the archive as she opened its brittle pages. The words within were formal, distant, the careful language of official record-keeping. But even through that distance, the tragedy of what had happened came through with painful clarity. Rowan Ashworth had been a beloved king, the record said, known throughout the territories for his fairness and his devotion to his people. He had ruled alongside his mate, Queen Wren, and together they had raised a single son, Chaol, who even as a young boy had shown the sharp intelligence and quiet strength that would one day make him a formidable leader in his own right. The coup had come without warning, launched by a rival pack from the northern borders, led by an ambitious alpha named Corwin Draven, who had long resented the Ashworth family's hold on the region's most fertile territories. The attack had struck during the night, setting fire to the palace's eastern wing while the royal family slept, creating chaos and confusion that allowed Draven's forces to move quickly through the corridors. Queen Wren had been killed in the initial assault, the record stated plainly. Her body found the following morning among the ashes of the royal chambers. Young Chaol, then only 12 years old, had been rescued by loyal guards and smuggled out through a hidden passage, surviving the attack that claimed his mother's life. Rowan Ashworth, however, had never been found. The records noted extensive searches conducted in the weeks and months following the coup, search parties combing through the ruins of the eastern wing and the surrounding forests, but no trace of the former king was ever discovered. After 1 year, as tradition required, he was formally declared dead, and the throne passed fully to his young son, who was forced to take up the burden of leadership far earlier than any child should have to bear. Ilara sat back from the book, her hands trembling slightly as she processed everything she had just read. A fire, a boy running from danger, a father who had vanished without a trace, presumed dead but never truly confirmed. It fit. Every fragmented piece of memory the old man had shared with her fit disturbingly, undeniably well. She closed the book carefully and returned it to the archivist, thanking her, before hurrying back through the palace corridors, her mind racing faster than her feet could carry her. She needed to see him again. She needed to look at his face with this new knowledge in mind and see if the resemblance she had begun to suspect held true. When she reached the small room near the kitchens, she found the old man sitting by the window, as he often did now, watching the courtyard below with quiet, thoughtful eyes. He turned to greet her as she entered, his expression brightening with the easy warmth that had grown between them over the past week. "You seem troubled," he observed immediately, studying her face with the same sharp perceptiveness he always seemed to carry, despite the fog that still clouded so much of his memory. Ilara hesitated, unsure of how to begin, unsure even of whether she should share what she had learned before she had more certainty to offer him. The last thing she wanted was to plant false hope, or worse, dangerous truths, in a mind still healing from trauma she could not fully understand. "I was in the archive," she said finally, choosing her words with care, "reading about the history of this kingdom." Something flickered across the old man's face, subtle but unmistakable. "And what did you learn?" "About a fire," Ilara said quietly, watching his reaction closely. 18 years ago, about a king who was never found." The old man's good hand tightened suddenly on the arm of his chair, his knuckles going white with the force of his grip. His breathing grew shallow, quick, and for a long moment, He said nothing at all, simply staring at some point beyond the window, his expression caught somewhere between recognition and terror. "Rowan," he whispered finally, so softly Alara almost missed it. That was his name, the king who was lost. "Yes," Alara said gently. "That's my name too," he said, turning to look at her now, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that made her chest ache in sympathy. You think that I might be him, don't you?" Alara did not answer immediately, unwilling to speak a truth she could not yet fully confirm. But her silence was answer enough, and she watched as the old man's face crumpled beneath the weight of a possibility too large and too frightening to fully comprehend. "If that's true," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "then the boy in my memories, the one running through the fire, calling out my name, might be the king," Alara finished softly. "Cale." The old man closed his eyes, a single tear slipping free and tracing a slow path down his weathered cheek. "My son," he breathed, the words carrying a lifetime of grief and longing, compressed into 2 simple syllables. "If that's true, then somewhere in this palace, my son has been living and ruling, believing his father dead for 18 years, while I wandered lost and broken, unable even to remember his face." Alara knelt beside his chair, taking his trembling hand gently in both of hers. "We don't know for certain, not yet. But if it is true, then he deserves to know, and you deserve the chance to remember him fully, to reclaim what was taken from you." "I'm frightened," the old man admitted, his voice raw and honest, in a way Alara had not heard from him before. "What if I'm wrong? What if I give him false hope, only to disappoint him? What if the boy I remember has grown into someone I no longer recognize, someone who has learned to live without a father, and my sudden return only brings him pain instead of joy? Or," Alara said softly, "what if he has spent 18 years grieving a loss he never fully accepted, and this is the moment everything finally comes back together? You won't know unless you try, and I'll be right here beside you, every step of the way." The old man studied her face for a long moment, something like gratitude and wonder mingling in his tired eyes. "How did I come to deserve such kindness from a stranger?" "You're not a stranger anymore," Alara said, offering him a small, steady smile. "Not to me." Outside, the afternoon sun continued its slow descent toward evening, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard where, somewhere among the palace towers, King Cale Ashworth sat in a private council meeting, entirely unaware that the answer to a grief he had carried silently for 18 years was waiting for him just a short walk away. In a small room near the kitchens, held gently in the trembling, hopeful hands of a woman who had never once wanted a crown, but was about to help restore an entire kingdom's broken heart. For 2 days, Alara said nothing to the king. It was not an easy decision. Every part of her wanted to march directly into the throne room and tell Cale what she suspected, to give him the chance to see the old man's face for himself and draw his own conclusions. But something held her back, a cautious instinct she could not quite name, warning her that a truth this large could not be delivered carelessly. Instead, she spent those 2 days quietly gathering more evidence, watching the old man closely for any additional signs, any further fragments of memory that might confirm what she already believed in her heart to be true. It was on the morning of the 3rd day that she noticed the locket. She had helped him change into fresh clothing brought by one of the kitchen servants, simple garments far more comfortable than the tattered rags he had arrived in, when she caught sight of a thin chain around his neck, mostly hidden beneath the collar of his shirt. Curious, she gently drew it free, revealing a small, tarnished silver locket etched with an intricate design. Her breath caught the moment she recognized it. The crest was unmistakable, even beneath years of grime and neglect. A wolf standing beneath a crescent moon, encircled by a ring of thorns, exactly matching the royal banners that hung throughout the palace, exactly matching the seal she had seen stamped into official documents in the archive. The Ashworth crest. "Where did this come from?" she asked softly, turning the locket carefully in her fingers. The old man looked down at it, his expression uncertain. "I don't know. I've had it as long as I can remember waking up here, though I couldn't tell you how long I wore it before that. It felt important somehow, so I never removed it, even when everything else about myself remained a mystery. Elara's hands trembled slightly as she carefully pried the tiny clasp open, revealing a small portrait tucked inside, faded and worn, but still clearly visible. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair, her smile warm and gentle, gazing out from within the tiny frame, as though captured in a single perfect moment of happiness. "Do you recognize her?" Elara asked, holding the locket up so he could see it clearly. The old man stared at the portrait for a long, silent moment, and then, slowly, his eyes filled with tears. "Ren," he whispered, the name breaking free from somewhere deep and buried within him. Her name was Ren. She was... He paused, his breath catching. She was my mate, my wife. Elara felt her own eyes sting with sympathetic tears, watching the raw grief and recognition flood across his face. "Rowan," she said softly, using the name with certainty now for the first time. "I think you need to see the king." He looked up at her, fear and hope tangled together behind his eyes. "I'm frightened, Elara." "I know," she said gently, "but I'll be right beside you. I promise." Together, they made their way slowly through the palace corridors, the old man's steps still careful and measured, though far stronger now than they had been the day Elara first found him collapsed at the gates. Servants and guards paused to stare as they passed, whispers following in their wake, though none dared to interfere with whatever purpose seemed to be carrying them forward with such quiet determination. They found Kale in his private study, bent over a stack of official documents, his expression tired and drawn in the way it so often seemed to be these days. He looked up in surprise as Elara entered without waiting for permission, the old man leaning slightly on her arm behind her. "Elara," Kale said, rising from his desk, his gaze immediately shifting to the old man beside her, sharp and searching. "What is this? Has something happened?" "I need you to look at something," Elara said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. She stepped forward and carefully placed the open locket into Kale's hand. The king's expression shifted the moment his eyes fell upon the tiny portrait inside. All the color drained from his face, his hand beginning to tremble as he stared down at the image of his mother, gone now for 18 long years, her warm smile captured forever in a piece of jewelry he had believed lost forever in the ashes of that terrible night. "Where," Kale said, his voice barely more than a rasp, "did you get this?" "He was wearing it," Elara said gently, gesturing toward the old man, who stood quietly beside her, watching Kale's reaction with an expression of dawning, desperate hope, around his neck. He didn't know why it felt important, only that it did. Kale's gaze finally lifted from the locket, moving slowly, almost fearfully, to study the old man's face for the first time with this new understanding, this impossible, aching possibility taking root in his mind. He stepped closer, his breath coming faster, his eyes tracing every line and feature of a face aged nearly 2 decades beyond the one he remembered from his childhood. "Father?" The word came out broken, barely audible, torn from somewhere deep within him, that Elara suspected he had kept carefully locked away for 18 long years. The old man's face crumpled, tears spilling freely now down his weathered cheeks. "Kale," he whispered, reaching out with trembling hands. "My boy, my son." For a long moment, neither of them moved, simply staring at each other, across the small distance of the study. 2 men separated by nearly 2 decades of grief and loss, standing now on the precipice of a reunion neither had dared to hope for. Then Kale crossed the remaining distance in 3 quick strides and pulled his father into his arms, his composed, careful control finally shattering completely as great, racking sobs tore through his chest. The old man held him just as tightly, his own tears soaking into his son's shoulder, both of them clinging to each other, as though afraid the other might vanish again if they let go. Elara stood back, watching the reunion, with tears streaming freely down her own face, her heart aching with a fullness she could hardly contain. She had not expected, when she knelt beside a broken stranger in the dirt 8 days earlier, that her small act of kindness would lead to this moment, this impossible, beautiful reunion between a king and the father he had mourned for nearly half his life. "I thought you were dead," Kale said finally, pulling back just enough to look at his father's face, his hands still gripping his shoulders, as though he needed the physical contact to believe this was truly happening. 18 years, father. 18 years. I believed you had died in that fire, alongside Mother. I don't remember most of it, Rowan admitted, his voice still thick with emotion. The fire, the escape, whatever happened after, it's all fragments and shadows in my mind. I only know that I have been lost, truly and completely lost, until this remarkable young woman found me, collapsed at the palace gates, and refused to leave me behind. Cale's gaze turned to Alara then, and the expression on his face was unlike anything she had seen from him before, raw gratitude mixed with something else entirely, something warmer and far more complicated than simple thanks. You saved my father's life, Cale said quietly, stepping toward her. While every other candidate in that courtyard was competing for my attention, you walked away to help a man you owed nothing to, expecting nothing in return. I didn't know who he was, Ilara said softly. I only knew he needed help. That, Cale said, his voice carrying a weight and sincerity that made her breath catch, is precisely why it matters so much. Rowan watched the exchange between them with a small, knowing smile beginning to form despite the tears still drying on his cheeks, something like quiet understanding settling behind his eyes as he studied the way his son looked at the young woman standing before them, as though seeing her clearly, truly, for the very first time. Outside the study window, the sun continued its steady climb toward midday, illuminating a palace that was about to be forever changed by the truth that had finally, after 18 long years of silence and grief, found its way home. And standing at the very center of that change, entirely unprepared for the role fate had chosen for her, stood a healer's daughter who had never wanted a crown, but had somehow, through nothing more than simple, unwavering kindness, become the thread connecting a broken family back together again. News of the former king's return spread through Blackthorn Ridge like fire through dry grass. By the following morning, every servant, every guard, and every candidate within the palace walls had heard some version of the story, each retelling growing more dramatic than the last. Some said the old beggar had turned out to be a wandering spirit, brought back through sheer magic. Others insisted he had been held captive all these years in some hidden dungeon, only recently managing his escape. The truth, though remarkable enough on its own, seemed to matter less to the rumor mill than the sheer excitement of having something new to whisper about. Cale called for a formal council meeting that afternoon, gathering his most trusted advisors, senior guards, and pack elders into the Great Hall to address the situation directly, before speculation could spiral further out of control. Alara was asked to attend as well, standing quietly near the back of the room, while Rowan sat in a place of honor near his son, dressed now in proper clothing, his hair trimmed, and his color continuing to improve with each passing day of proper food and rest. 18 years ago, Cale began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, we believed my father died in the fire that took my mother's life, during the coup led by Alpha Corwin Draven and his forces. That belief has now been proven false. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, though Cale raised a hand for silence before continuing. My father survived that night, though the details of how remain unclear, even to him. His memory was severely damaged, likely from injuries sustained during his escape, and he has spent the past 18 years lost, wandering, unable to recall his own identity, until fate brought him to our gates just over a week ago. Cale paused, his gaze finding Alara's across the room, warm and grateful. And until the kindness of one remarkable young woman ensured he survived long enough to be recognized. Ilara felt heat rise to her cheeks as dozens of eyes turned toward her, but she held her chin steady, refusing to shrink beneath the sudden attention. This changes many things, Cale continued, turning back to address the council. Foremost among them, I am suspending the mate selection ceremony, effective immediately. A wave of startled murmurs swept through the hall, louder this time, several of the gathered candidates near the front exchanging shocked, worried glances. Bianca Hale, seated prominently among them, looked as though she had been struck across the face. Your Majesty, one of the older council members said carefully, rising from his seat. With respect, the selection was arranged specifically to secure your line, to ensure stability for the kingdom. Suspending it now, especially amid such upheaval, could create further uncertainty among the packs. I understand the concern, Kale said evenly, but I cannot in good conscience continue a ceremony built entirely around political convenience while my father's safety, and the safety of everyone connected to this revelation, remains uncertain. Alpha Draven's forces orchestrated the attack that nearly killed my entire family 18 years ago. If word reaches them that my father has survived, and might yet recall the details of that night, they will not hesitate to act again, more decisively this time. The hall fell silent at that, the weight of his words settling heavily over the gathered crowd. Elara felt a chill run through her, the old man's fearful words from that very first day at the gate echoing suddenly in her memory. Don't tell them I'm here. They'll find me. They'll finish what they started. What do you propose, Your Majesty? The council member asked finally. Increased security throughout the palace, effective immediately, Kale said firmly. My father will remain under careful watch at all times, and I want a thorough investigation launched into Draven's current activities and whereabouts. If he learns of my father's return, I want us prepared for whatever response follows. The council members exchanged uncertain glances, but none dared openly challenge their king's decision, especially not with the weight of such a personal and dangerous revelation hanging over the room. One by one, they nodded their agreement, and Kale dismissed the meeting shortly after, the hall slowly emptying as servants and nobles alike filed out, already whispering fresh speculation among themselves. Elara lingered near the back, uncertain of what to do now that the formal proceedings had ended, when Kale's voice called out softly behind her, Elara, wait, please. She turned to find him approaching, Rowan following a step behind, both of them wearing expressions that suggested this conversation was far from finished. I owe you a debt I don't know how to properly repay, Kale said once they were close enough to speak privately, the last of the departing crowd filtering out through the great hall's tall doors. You saved my father's life without knowing who he was, and in doing so, you have given me back something I believed lost forever. I only did what felt right, Elara said honestly. I don't need repayment for that. Perhaps not, Kale said, but you deserve my gratitude regardless. He paused, something uncertain flickering across his expression, an emotion far more vulnerable than the composed authority she had grown used to seeing from him. And I find myself curious about something else entirely, if you'll permit the question. Of course, Your Majesty. You said, that first day, that you never wanted to be here, that you had no interest in the crown, or in catching my attention. Kale studied her carefully, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. I find myself wondering whether that remains true, even now. Elara hesitated, unsure exactly how to answer a question that felt far more complicated than it had a right to be. I still have no interest in a crown, she said slowly, choosing her words with care. But I find that I've grown to care a great deal about your father's well-being these past days. And I confess, Your Majesty, that you yourself have proven far more thoughtful than the cold, distant king the rumors made you out to be. A small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of Kale's mouth, the first true smile Elara had seen from him since her arrival at the palace. Only you would manage to insult and compliment me within the same breath. I've been told I have a gift for it, Elara said, unable to fully suppress her own answering smile. Beside them, Rowan watched the exchange with quiet, amused satisfaction, his tired eyes carrying a warmth that had not been there just days before, when confusion and fear had dominated so much of his expression. I remember very little of my own life, he said softly, drawing both their attention. But I remember enough to recognize when two people are dancing carefully around something neither has yet found the courage to name aloud. Father, Kale said, a hint of warning in his tone, though it lacked any real heat. I'm simply stating an observation, Rowan said innocently, though the small smile playing at his lips suggested otherwise. An old man's privilege, perhaps. Elara felt her cheeks warm again, though this time the sensation carried something far more pleasant beneath the embarrassment. She glanced at Kale, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something patient and searching all at once, as though he were waiting to see whether she might deny his father's observation, or confirm it. She chose neither, offering instead a small, careful smile, before excusing herself politely, claiming a need to check on preparations for the evening meal. But as she walked away, her heart continued to pound with a strange, unfamiliar warmth, and she found herself glancing back once, just briefly, to find Chaol still watching her from across the emptying hall, his expression unreadable, but no longer nearly as cold or distant as it had seemed the very first day she arrived. Behind them, unseen by either, Rowan watched the entire exchange with quiet satisfaction, already sensing, even through the fog that still clouded so much of his memory, that something important and lasting had begun to take root between his son and the remarkable young woman who had saved them both. But danger was already stirring beyond the palace walls, gathering in the shadows of the northern territories, where Alpha Corwin Draven had just received word, through a spy carefully placed among the palace staff, that the former king he believed long dead had somehow, impossibly, returned. And Draven, ever cautious and ruthless in equal measure, was not a man inclined to leave loose threads unresolved. A week passed in relative peace, though an undercurrent of tension ran through the palace, unspoken but ever present, like the quiet hum before a coming storm. Rowan continued to grow stronger, both in body and mind, though his memory remained frustratingly incomplete. He could now recall his late wife with clarity, could describe entire conversations they had shared decades earlier, could even remember small details about Chaol's childhood that brought fresh tears to the king's eyes each time they surfaced. But the events of the coup itself remained largely locked away, buried beneath trauma too severe for his mind to fully release. Elara continued visiting him daily, though her role had shifted subtly over the past week, no longer that of a caretaker tending to a stranger, but something closer to family, welcomed warmly by both father and son alike. She found herself spending more time in Chaol's company as well, their conversations growing longer and easier with each visit, the careful formality between them slowly giving way to something far more comfortable. It was during one such visit, on a quiet evening while Rowan rested and Chaol walked with Elara through the palace gardens, that the first sign of danger arrived. A guard approached them hurriedly, his expression tight with barely controlled alarm. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption. We've apprehended someone attempting to breach the eastern wall, near the servants' quarters." Chaol's posture shifted instantly, all traces of the relaxed warmth from moments before vanishing beneath the sharp, commanding focus of a king addressing a threat. "Who?" "A stranger, Your Majesty. He carried no identification, but our patrol found maps on him, detailed sketches of the palace layout, particularly the servants' wing, where the former king has been staying." Elara felt her stomach drop, cold dread flooding through her, as Chaol's jaw tightened visibly. "Bring him to the interrogation chamber immediately. I want to speak with him myself." The guard nodded and hurried off, and Chaol turned to Elara, his expression grim. "This is precisely what I feared. Draven has learned of my father's return. What will you do?" Elara asked, struggling to keep the fear from her own voice. "Whatever is necessary to keep him safe," Chaol said firmly. "And you as well. If this intruder was mapping the servants' quarters, he wasn't simply seeking my father. You've been seen with him constantly these past 2 weeks. You may be a target now too." The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her, though she refused to let it show openly. "I'm not afraid," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her words somewhat. "You should be," Chaol said, his tone softer now, though no less serious. "Draven is a ruthless man. He orchestrated the death of my mother and the attempted murder of my father without hesitation. He will not think twice about eliminating anyone who stands between him and ensuring my father never regains enough memory to expose him fully." They made their way quickly to the interrogation chamber, where the captured intruder sat bound to a chair, flanked by 2 stern-faced guards. He was a lean, weathered man, his eyes darting nervously between Chaol and the guards as they entered, though he said nothing, his jaw set in stubborn silence. "Who sent you?" Chaol demanded, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. The man remained silent, his eyes fixed on some point on the floor, refusing to meet the king's gaze. "I'll ask once more," Chaol said, his tone dropping into something far more dangerous. "Who sent you to map the servants' quarters where my father is staying?" Still, the man said nothing, though Elara noticed the slight tremor that had begun in his hands, betraying the fear he was struggling to conceal beneath his stubborn silence. He's terrified of whoever sent him, Elara said quietly, stepping forward slightly. More terrified of them than of you, it seems. Kale glanced at her, something calculating entering his expression, before he turned back to the prisoner. If you cooperate, I can offer you protection from whoever you fear. If you continue this silence, I have no way of shielding you from either side. The man's resolve seemed to waver slightly at that, his eyes finally lifting to meet Kale's. You don't understand, he said, his voice rough and low. Draven doesn't forgive failure. If I talk, and word gets back to him that I did, my family pays the price. He's already made that clear to everyone he's recruited. Then let me offer you something better than fear, Kale said, his tone shifting subtly, gentler now, though still firm. Tell me what you know, and I will personally ensure your family's protection, moved somewhere safe, far beyond Draven's reach. You have my word as king. The man studied Kale's face for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing the king's offer against the very real danger of betrayal. Finally, something in him seemed to break, exhaustion and fear giving way to reluctant cooperation. Draven learned of your father's survival through a spy placed among your palace staff, the man admitted quietly. Someone close enough to the situation to overhear the council meeting where you announced it. He's been planning for years, always fearing this exact possibility, that your father might survive and eventually recall enough to expose his role in the coup. Who is the spy? Kale demanded. I don't know, the man said, shaking his head quickly. I swear it. I was only sent to gather information on the palace layout, to help plan a more direct approach if the spy's information wasn't sufficient. A more direct approach, Kale repeated, his voice hardening. Meaning what, exactly? The man hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elara before returning to Kale. Meaning Draven intends to finish what he started 18 years ago. He wants your father silenced permanently, before any more memories can surface. And anyone connected closely enough to your father to have learned dangerous details along the way. His gaze lingered pointedly on Elara this time, and her blood ran cold at the implication. Kale's expression darkened further, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. When does he plan to act? Soon, the man said. That's all I know. He's grown impatient, worried that time is working against him now that your father's memory continues to improve. Kale turned to the guards flanking the prisoner. Take him to secure quarters. See that he and his family are protected, exactly as promised. He turned then to Elara, his expression a mixture of fury and fear that made her chest tighten in response. We need to increase security immediately, around my father, and around you as well. Around me? Elara asked, though she already suspected the answer. You've become a target simply through your association with him, Kale said grimly. I won't risk losing you to Draven's ambitions, not after everything you've already given to protect my father. Something in his voice, some raw, unguarded fear beneath the royal authority, made Elara's heart skip painfully. She stepped closer to him, reaching out to gently touch his arm, an instinctive gesture of comfort she hadn't fully considered before offering it. We'll face it together, she said softly. Whatever comes. Kale looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her steady, determined eyes, and something shifted visibly in his expression. The careful walls he had maintained for so long finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of everything they now faced together. Together, he agreed quietly, his voice carrying a warmth and vulnerability that felt like a promise far beyond the immediate danger surrounding them. Outside the interrogation chamber, the palace continued its evening routines, unaware of the storm quietly gathering on its horizon. But within the quiet corridors and hidden chambers, a king, his newly returned father, and the healer's daughter who had brought them back together, now found themselves bound tightly by a shared danger, each of them determined, in their own way, to protect what mattered most, whatever the cost might ultimately be. Security throughout the palace tightened dramatically over the following days. Guards now stood watch outside Rowan's chambers around the clock, and Kale had insisted on moving Elara from the shared quarters she had occupied with the other candidates into a private room closer to the royal wing, close enough that additional guards could watch over her as well. She had protested initially, uncomfortable with the sudden shift in her circumstances, but Kale's quiet, unwavering insistence, backed by genuine worry rather than mere authority, had eventually worn down her objections. "I don't like feeling like a prisoner," she admitted one evening, as they walked together along a heavily guarded section of the palace's inner courtyard, two guards trailing at a respectful distance behind them. "You're not a prisoner," Kale said gently. "You're someone I care about deeply, and someone I refuse to lose to a man who has already taken far too much from my family." Ilara glanced at him, something warm blooming in her chest at the easy honesty of his words. Over the past 2 weeks, the careful distance that had once defined their interactions had steadily dissolved, replaced by a closeness that felt both natural and slightly overwhelming in its intensity. She found herself looking forward to their conversations more than she cared to admit, found herself noticing the small, genuine smiles he offered her now, so different from the guarded expression he wore before nearly everyone else. "Have you learned anything more about the spy within the palace?" she asked, steering the conversation toward the pressing danger that continued to hang over all of them. Kale's expression sobered immediately. "Not yet. My most trusted advisors are conducting a quiet investigation, but whoever it is, has been careful, leaving no obvious trail. It could be anyone. A servant, a guard, even someone within the council itself." "That's a frightening thought," Ilara said softly. "It is," Kale agreed, "which is precisely why I need you to remain vigilant, Ilara. Trust no one fully right now, beyond myself, my father, and the guards I've personally assigned to your protection." She nodded, though the weight of his warning settled uneasily over her. The palace, once merely intimidating in its grandeur and unfamiliar customs, now felt like a maze filled with hidden dangers, any friendly face potentially masking a hidden threat. Their walk was interrupted by the arrival of a palace messenger, breathless and clearly anxious, who bowed hastily before Kale. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. Your father is asking for you. He says he's remembered something important." Kale's expression shifted instantly to sharp focus, and he and Ilara hurried together toward Rowan's chambers, their earlier conversation forgotten in the face of this new development. They found Rowan seated by his window, his expression pale and shaken, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. "Father," Kale said, moving quickly to his side. "What is it? What have you remembered?" Rowan looked up at them, his eyes carrying a haunted quality that immediately concerned Ilara. "The night of the fire," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him considerable effort. "I remember more of it now, pieces fitting together, finally, after all these years." "Tell me," Kale said gently, settling into the chair beside his father, Ilara taking up a position just behind them, close enough to offer silent support. "I remember the attack beginning," Rowan said, his gaze distant, lost in the reconstruction of a memory long buried. "Fire spreading through the eastern wing, faster than anyone anticipated. Your mother, pushing me toward the escape passage, insisting I take you, and run while she held the door against the attackers." His voice broke slightly. "I didn't want to leave her. I remember fighting her on it, but she was insistent, said someone needed to survive to protect you properly, and she was already wounded too badly to make it out herself." Ilara felt tears prick at her own eyes, watching the pain wash across both father and son's faces as this terrible memory finally surfaced in full. "I got you to the passage," Rowan continued, "and I remember guards meeting us there, taking you from my arms to carry you to safety. I turned back, wanting to help your mother, but the passage collapsed behind me before I could return. I was trapped on the wrong side, alone, with the fire spreading closer." "How did you escape?" Kale asked softly. "I don't fully remember," Rowan admitted, frustration creasing his brow. "Fragments only, running through unfamiliar corridors, finding a window, falling perhaps, though I can't be certain. Everything after that is confusion and pain, wandering for what felt like an eternity, though I couldn't tell you how long it truly was." "But you remember the attack itself now," Kale pressed gently. "Do you remember who led it? Who specifically ordered the fire, the assault on the palace?" Rowan's expression tightened, something dark and frightened passing behind his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "I remember his face clearly now. Corwin Draven. He was there personally, directing his forces from just outside the palace gates. I saw him through the smoke, just before the passage collapsed." Kale's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury. That confirms what we already suspected, but having your direct testimony changes everything. With your account, formally given before the full council, we have grounds to move against him openly, rather than merely investigating quietly from the shadows. He'll know I've remembered, Rowan said, fear creeping into his voice. If word reaches him, and given that we already know he has a spy within these walls, he will act swiftly and violently to prevent me from testifying. Then we move quickly too, Cale said firmly. I'll call an emergency council session for tomorrow morning. Once your testimony is formally recorded and witnessed by the full council, silencing you will no longer serve any purpose for him. The truth will already be established. And in the meantime? Elara asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Tonight, tomorrow morning, before the council session takes place? That's precisely when he's most likely to act, isn't it? Before the truth becomes public knowledge? Cale's expression grew grim as he considered her words, the truth of them settling heavily over the room. You're right, he said finally. We need additional protection tonight, more than what we currently have in place. He rose and moved to the door, calling for the guard stationed outside. Double the watch on my father's chambers immediately, and bring me my most trusted captain. We need to discuss additional security measures before nightfall. As the guard hurried off to relay the orders, Cale turned back to his father and Elara, his expression a careful mask over what Elara suspected was considerable fear. Fear he was working hard to keep hidden for their sake. We'll get through tonight, he said, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. And tomorrow, we'll ensure Draven finally answers for everything he's done. Rowan reached out and gripped his son's hand tightly, an echo of the same gesture Elara remembered him offering her weeks earlier, warm and reassuring despite his own obvious fear. I trust you completely, Cale. You've grown into a king far stronger and wiser than I ever could have hoped, even during the years I couldn't remember watching you do it. Cale's composed expression finally cracked slightly at his father's words, emotion flickering openly across his face before he carefully schooled it back into control. I had good teachers, he said quietly, even if I lost you far too early to learn everything I needed directly. Elara watched the tender exchange between them, her heart aching with both the beauty of their reunion and the fear of what dangers still lay ahead. Whatever came next, whatever Draven attempted in his desperation to silence the truth before it could be formally spoken, she knew with absolute certainty that she would stand beside this family, protecting them however she could, for however long it took to see this threat finally, completely ended. Outside, the sun continued its slow descent toward evening, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and red, while somewhere beyond the palace walls, in the shadowed territories of the north, Alpha Corwin Draven received urgent word from his palace spy that the former king's memory had fully returned, and that a council session had been called for the following morning. His response was immediate, and utterly without mercy. Night fell heavily over the palace, thick clouds rolling in to blot out what little moonlight might otherwise have offered comfort against the darkness. Elara sat beside Rowan's bed, unable to sleep despite Cale's gentle insistence that she rest, while the additional guards he had summoned took up their positions throughout the royal wing. The captain of the guard, a stern, capable woman named Fiona Marsh, had personally overseen the placement of extra sentries at every entrance and window, determined to leave no opportunity for Draven's forces to slip through unnoticed. You should try to sleep, Rowan said gently, noticing the tension in Elara's posture as she sat near the window, watching the darkened courtyard below. I couldn't, even if I tried, Elara admitted. Not tonight. Rowan studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. You've given so much of yourself to protect me these past weeks, a man you owed absolutely nothing to when you first found me. I hope you know how deeply that kindness has mattered, not just to me, but to my son as well. I only did what felt right, Elara said, echoing words she had spoken many times before, though they felt even truer now than they had at the very beginning. Cale cares for you, Rowan said quietly, more than I think he's fully admitted, even to himself. I've watched the way he looks at you these past weeks. It reminds me very much of the way I used to look at his mother. Elara felt warmth rise to her cheeks despite the tension of the evening. I care for him too, she admitted softly. More than I expected to, given how differently I imagined this entire experience would unfold. Rowan smiled, though the expression carried a weariness that spoke to the exhausting weight of the day's revelations. Fate has a strange way of leading us exactly where we're meant to be, even when we never intended to walk that particular path. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by a sudden, sharp cry from somewhere down the corridor, followed immediately by the clash of metal and the shouts of alarmed guards. Ilara's heart leapt into her throat as she rose quickly to her feet, moving instinctively to position herself between Rowan's bed and the door. "Stay behind me," she said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her determination. The door burst open moments later, and Ilara nearly cried out in relief when she saw it was Cale, his expression tight with urgency, a small contingent of guards flanking him protectively. "We've spotted intruders scaling the eastern wall," he said quickly, moving to check on his father before turning his sharp attention to Ilara. "Draven didn't wait for morning. He's making his move now." "How many?" Rowan asked, rising from the bed despite his still recovering strength. "Unclear," Cale said. "Fiona's forces are engaging them near the servants' entrance, but I want you both moved somewhere more secure immediately. There's a hidden chamber beneath the throne room, built generations ago for exactly this kind of emergency." They moved quickly through the corridors, guards surrounding them protectively on all sides, the distant sounds of conflict growing louder as they hurried toward the throne room. Ilara's heart pounded with fear, though she forced herself to remain steady, focusing on nothing beyond placing one foot in front of the other, following Cale's lead through the darkened palace. They had nearly reached the hidden chamber when a figure stepped out from a side corridor, blocking their path entirely. Ilara recognized him instantly, despite the shadows obscuring much of his face: the palace steward, a quiet, unassuming man named Edmund, who had served the royal family faithfully for years, or so everyone had believed. "I'm sorry it has to end this way," Edmund said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Ilara remembered from their brief, polite interactions over the past weeks. "Draven pays exceptionally well, and threatens even more thoroughly. My family's safety was never something I could risk against loyalty to a king who barely knew my name." "You're the spy," Cale said, his voice cold with barely controlled fury, stepping protectively in front of his father and Ilara. "I am," Edmund confirmed, no hint of shame in his expression. "And I'm afraid I cannot allow you to reach that chamber. Draven's orders were clear. The former king does not survive this night, and anyone standing too closely beside him shares that fate." Ilara's breath caught with fear, but before Edmund could act further, Fiona Marsh appeared suddenly behind him, moving with the swift, practiced efficiency of a seasoned warrior, quickly subduing the traitor before he could raise any real resistance. Additional guards flooded the corridor moments later, securing Edmund firmly and dragging him away as he shouted useless protests into the chaos surrounding them. "The eastern intruders have been contained," Fiona reported quickly, breathing hard from the exertion of the encounter. "3 captured, 2 others fled back over the wall when they realized we were prepared for them. But Your Majesty, I strongly recommend you still move your father to the secure chamber. We don't yet know if Draven sent additional forces we haven't accounted for." Cale nodded sharply, ushering his father and Ilara the remaining distance to the hidden chamber, a small, fortified room built into the palace's ancient foundations, accessible only through a cleverly concealed passage behind the throne room's back wall. Once inside, with the heavy door sealed securely behind them, the sounds of the chaos above faded into a muffled, distant echo. "Are you both all right?" Cale asked, his eyes moving between his father and Ilara with obvious concern. "We're fine," Rowan said, though his voice carried the exhaustion of a body still recovering from years of hardship, now further strained by the night's frightening events. "Thanks entirely to your quick thinking, and Fiona's excellent training of her guards." Cale turned to Ilara then, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands, his expression carrying a raw fear that finally, in this small moment of relative safety, broke fully through his careful composure. "I nearly lost you tonight," he said quietly. "If Edmund had reached you before Fiona intervened." "But he didn't," Ilara said softly, covering his hands with her own. "We're safe, all of us." "For now," Cale said, though the tenderness in his eyes did not waver despite the lingering worry in his words. But this isn't over, Ilara. Draven will not simply accept tonight's failure quietly. If anything, this makes him more dangerous, more desperate. Then we face that too, Ilara said firmly, echoing the same promise she had offered him days before. Together. Kale's expression softened further, something achingly tender passing between them in the dim, flickering candlelight of the small chamber. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle, careful kiss to her forehead, a gesture that carried far more weight and meaning than words alone could have conveyed. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin, "for refusing to give up on my father that very first day. For refusing to give up on any of us, even now, when the danger has grown so much greater than either of us anticipated." Rowan watched the tender exchange between them with quiet, exhausted satisfaction, a small smile finally breaking through the tension of the night's events. Whatever else happened in the coming days, whatever confrontation still awaited them with Draven and his forces, he found himself deeply, profoundly grateful for the remarkable young woman who had walked into their lives with nothing more than a kind heart and an unwavering determination to help a stranger in need. Outside the hidden chamber, the palace slowly settled back into uneasy quiet as guards secured the grounds and tended to the aftermath of the failed assault. But everyone within those walls now understood, with absolute clarity, that the battle against Alpha Corwin Draven was far from finished. The morning's council session would proceed as planned, Rowan's testimony finally given before the full weight of royal authority, and whatever came after would determine, once and for all, whether justice would finally be served for a crime committed 18 long years ago. Morning arrived with a pale, watery light filtering through the great hall's tall windows, illuminating the gathered council members who had assembled hastily following the previous night's chaos. Word of the failed assault and the steward's betrayal had already spread through the palace, and the hall buzzed with tense, anxious energy as Kale took his place at the head of the council table, Rowan seated with dignity beside him, and Ilara standing close by, no longer relegated to the back of the room but welcomed openly at the family's side. "Last night," Kale began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, "agents working under Alpha Corwin Draven attempted to breach this palace and silence my father before he could offer testimony regarding the coup that took my mother's life 18 years ago. That attempt failed, thanks to the vigilance of our guards and the courage of those who stood against the intruders." Murmurs rippled through the gathered council, several members exchanging grim, worried glances. My father has now recovered sufficient memory of that night to identify, with absolute certainty, that Alpha Draven personally led the assault, Kale continued. "I ask that he share his account formally now, before this full council, so that the truth may finally be established beyond any doubt." Rowan rose slowly, his composure steady, despite the visible effort it clearly cost him to revisit such painful memories. He recounted the events of that terrible night with careful, deliberate detail, describing the fire, his wife's sacrifice, his desperate escape through collapsing passages, and the unmistakable sight of Corwin Draven directing his forces from beyond the palace gates. The council listened in heavy silence, the weight of 18 years of unresolved grief finally finding its answer. When Rowan finished speaking, an elderly council member rose slowly to his feet. This testimony, combined with the confession already extracted from Draven's captured agents last night, provides more than sufficient grounds for formal action. I move that we authorize immediate military response against Alpha Draven's territory to bring him before justice for his crimes. The motion passed swiftly, with unanimous support from every member of the gathered council. Kale's expression remained carefully controlled throughout, though Ilara could see the fierce determination burning beneath his measured exterior, a resolve 18 years in the making finally given purpose and direction. The following days passed in a blur of preparation, as Kale organized his forces and coordinated with allied pacts throughout the region, many of whom had long harbored their own grievances against Draven's aggressive territorial expansion. Ilara found herself drawn increasingly into these preparations as well, though her role remained centered primarily on caring for Rowan, whose strength continued to improve steadily with each passing day, even as the shadow of the coming confrontation hung heavily over the palace. The confrontation itself, when it finally came, was swift and decisive. Faced with the combined forces of Kael's allies and the undeniable weight of formal testimony and captured confessions, Draven's own pack quickly abandoned any pretense of loyalty to a leader whose crimes had finally been exposed so thoroughly. Draven was captured within days, brought before a formal tribunal to answer for his role in the coup that had shattered the Ashworth family nearly 2 decades earlier. Justice, when it was finally delivered, brought Kael and Rowan a measure of peace neither had expected to feel after so many years of unresolved grief. It did not erase the pain of Queen Wren's death, nor the years Rowan had spent lost and broken, wandering without memory or purpose, but it closed a chapter that had haunted the kingdom for far too long, allowing everyone touched by that terrible night to finally begin healing in earnest. Weeks later, on a warm afternoon with golden sunlight streaming across the palace courtyard, Kael called for a formal gathering of the full court, along with representatives from every allied pack throughout the region. Elara stood near the front of the assembled crowd, uncertain of the purpose behind such an unexpected ceremony, though Rowan's knowing smile beside her offered a hint that something significant was about to unfold. Elara stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, his expression carrying none of the guarded coldness that had once defined his public presence. "Many of you will remember," he began, "that I suspended the mate selection ceremony several weeks ago, following the return of my father and the dangers that emerged in its wake. I know many of you have wondered whether that ceremony might eventually resume." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, several of the remaining candidates, Bianca Hale prominently among them, straightening with renewed hope and attention. "It will not," Kael said simply, and the murmur grew louder, surprise and curiosity mingling openly now. "Because I have already found the woman I intend to spend my life beside, not through any formal ceremony or careful political calculation, but through the simplest, most genuine act of kindness imaginable." He turned then, extending his hand toward Elara, who stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, as the full weight of his intention became suddenly, overwhelmingly clear. "Elara Voss walked away from the very selection meant to win my attention," Kael continued, his voice carrying warmth and conviction that reached every corner of the silent, watching crowd. "To help a broken stranger she owed absolutely nothing to. She asked for no reward, sought no advantage, and expected nothing in return beyond the simple satisfaction of easing another person's suffering. In doing so, she not only saved my father's life, but restored something to this family that I believed lost forever." Elara moved forward slowly, her heart pounding, tears gathering in her eyes, as Kael took her hands gently in his own, kneeling before the entire assembled court, in a gesture of humility that silenced every remaining whisper throughout the courtyard. "Elara Voss," Kael said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in every word, "will you do me the honor of becoming my mate, my Luna, and my equal partner in leading this kingdom forward?" Elara looked past him, toward Rowan, who stood watching with tears of joy streaming freely down his weathered cheeks, nodding encouragingly, and then back to Kael himself, whose dark eyes held nothing but genuine hope and devotion. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, as happiness flooded through her entirely. "Yes, I will." The courtyard erupted into cheers and applause as Kael rose to his feet, pulling Elara into his arms and kissing her gently before the entire watching crowd, sealing a promise that had begun weeks earlier with nothing more than a kind heart, an injured stranger, and a healer's daughter who had never once wanted a crown but had found something far more valuable instead. Rowan approached them both once the celebration began to settle, embracing his son tightly before turning to Elara and pulling her into an equally warm, grateful embrace. "You saved us both," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "My life, and my son's heart. I could not have asked for a more remarkable daughter to welcome into this family." "Thank you," Elara said, her own tears finally spilling over freely, "for trusting me, that very first day, when you had every reason to be afraid of everyone around you." "Kindness recognizes kindness," Rowan said simply, offering her a warm, knowing smile. "Even through the deepest fog of a broken mind, some things remain unmistakably clear." As the celebration continued around them, the golden afternoon sun casting warm light across the joyful gathering, Kale pulled Alara close once more, resting his forehead gently against hers, both of them finally, fully allowing themselves to embrace the happiness that had grown from such an unexpected, humble beginning. What had started as a simple act of compassion toward a forgotten stranger at the palace gates had blossomed into a love neither of them had anticipated, a father reunited with his son, a kingdom freed from a dangerous hidden threat, and a healer's daughter who had never wanted a crown, now standing proudly beside the king, who had come to cherish her more than any ceremony or tradition ever could have provided. The mate selection had ended not with a chosen candidate parading through carefully staged ceremonies, but with a single, genuine moment of kindness that had rippled outward, touching every life it encountered, and ultimately restoring an entire kingdom's broken heart.